The last talk of this year's workshop will be given by Vera Hoffmann Kolss on the supervaluationist theory of causal indeterminacy. Please, Vera.
Okay, so thank you so much. And thanks to the organizers for setting up this wonderful workshop. So I really enjoyed being here so far, and thanks for inviting me to speak here. Yeah, so Christian has already mentioned the title of my presentation of my paper. And so my background is probably a little different from that of most of you. So I primarily work on causal models and intervention theories of causation. And what I'm going to present to you today is a phenomenon that I recently got interested in, namely the observation that sometimes the structures that you find in causal models can be affected with indeterminacy. And I'm going to explain to you what that means. And I think, so here, for the purposes of this talk, I will focus on Robert's interventionist theory of causation. And I think that the standard version of that theory cannot capture those cases of indeterminacy very well, and my proposal will be to supplement it with a precisificational, with a supervaluationist approach to improve on this. But this latter proposal is still work in progress, so I'm really happy to hear your comments on it. So here, let me start with an example that is supposed to illustrate a case of causal indeterminacy that has been around in the literature for a while. So the original structure has been proposed by Carolina Sartorio, I think. It involves soldiers killing each other, but because I don't like this, set up a more harmless example here, but it has exactly the same causal structure as the one proposed by Sartorio. So 1 hour before the start of the 10 a.m. classes, the janitor of a large university building learns that the lighting systems in 4 lecture rooms do not work. Fixing one of the systems takes almost an hour, so he can fix at most one of them. Not feeling up to discussing with the lecturers which of the systems to fix, he decides to stay in his office and do nothing.
That sounds a bit
And
like the
4 10 a.m. classes must be cancelled. So that is the example. And now there are lots of things that you can say about the causal structure of this scenario. And for now, I take it to be uncontroversial that the janitors in action caused something. Namely, it caused one of the classes to be cancelled. And of course, this presupposes that there can be absence causation, so that somebody is not doing anything can cause something. And I know this might not be as uncontroversial as I presented here, but just assume this for the moment. However, now you might wonder whether his doing nothing was also a cause of Jane's decision to cancel her class. So the presupposition is that she was one of the lecturers who were going to teach a class in one of those 4 rooms, and she had to cancel her class because it was dark inside. So, now if you think that questions about causal relations always have determinate answers, then you would think that the answer to this question is either yes or no. So, what happens if we say yes? Then the janitors doing nothing caused all 4 classes to be cancelled. Because there doesn't seem to be a relevant difference between Jane's class and any of the other classes. So if we say that his doing nothing caused her to cancel her class, then the same reasoning applies to all the other classes. However, given that he could have fixed at most one of the systems, this seems implausible. Now, suppose we answer no, then we find an analogous structure. The genitors doing nothing did not cause any of the classes to be cancelled. Again, there's no relevant difference between Jane's class and any of the other classes. However, since it is uncontroversial that he did cause something, at least if we accept this assumption, this is also implausible. And now, Bernstein and Swanson have recently argued that the best way to resolve this dilemma is to say that the causation question doesn't have a determinate answer. So, although the genitors in action determinately caused one of the classes to be cancelled, it is indeterminate which one. And therefore it's also indeterminate whether he caused Jane to cancel the class. And the indeterminate statement, therefore, is the genitors in action caused Jane to cancel her class. So the idea is that this statement doesn't have a determinate truth value. And now, as I already pointed out, the aim of this paper is to show that if Woodward's interventionism is combined with the supervaluationist approach, it can handle this case of causal indeterminacy and one other type of causal structure that involves indeterminacy, which I'm going to present to you.
Vera, I just want to make sure I get the case and I have the right intuition. So, isn't it true that the genitors in action determinately caused 3 of the classes to be cancelled, or am I misunderstanding?
No, the idea is, so you understand causation in terms of difference making, and he made a difference to at most one of the classes. Because that's the idea.
Okay.
Yeah. So 3 classes would have had to be cancelled anyway, because he could have.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the idea.
Okay. I don't know if I can. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's.
I don't know if I can make my brain work for that, but okay. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, we can discuss this later. I mean,
that's fine. I just thanks.
Okay, so here's the outline of my presentation. So I'm going to give you the basic idea of what was interventionism. Then I'm going to apply it to causal structures involving indeterminacy, and that is the case of the other structure that I'm going to explain to you. And I'm going to argue that this doesn't work very well, and then here's my proposed solution, and then I'm going to conclude. So, I think most of you will be familiar with the very basic idea of causal models and interventionism. So, the idea is that you can describe causal relations in terms of relations between variables, and these variables occur in directed causal graphs that consist of 2 elements, a set of vertices consisting of the variables that stand in causal relations to each other, and a set of directed edges that connect these vertices. And then x is defined as a direct cause of y if there is an intervention of x that makes a difference to y, and there is a directed edge between x and y in the graph, so this causal relation is represented by a directed edge in the graph, and x is causally relevant to y if and only if the graph contains a directed edge, or a chain of directed edges leading from x to y. So this is a bit sketchy, but for the purposes of what I'm going to do here, it doesn't matter. So the idea is that a causal graph could look like this, and here you would say that z is a direct cause of x, and w is causally relevant to x, because there is a directed path from w to x, but it's not direct because there's z in between. Now, these variables are assumed to always take several values, so at least 2 because they're variables. And now this is a general description of type level causation, but you can break it down to what people call actual causation, and here actual causation means that a variable's assuming a particular value, which can be, if you like, metaphysically speaking, conceived of as an event, causes another variable to take a particular value. And Woodward offers the following definition of actual causation. So this is a more or less literal quote from Woodward. I've only adapted the notation here a little bit. So x is an actual cause of y. No, well, sorry, x equals small x, and here capital X is the variable, small x is one particular value of that variable. So x equals x is an actual cause of y equals y if and only if the following two conditions are satisfied. So x and y are the actual values of the variables x and y. And for each directed path p from x to y, fix by interventions all direct courses zi of y that do not lie along p of some combination of values within their redundancy range. Then, to determine whether for each path from x to y and for each possible combination of values for the direct courses zi of y that are not on this route and that are in the redundancy range of zi, whether there is an intervention on x that will change the value of y. So this is self-referential there, but I don't think it's helpful. 2 is satisfied if the answer to this question is yes for at least one root and possible combination of values within the redundancy range of zi. So I think if you haven't seen this before, it's very hard to understand, but I'm going to give you an example that illustrates what's going on here, and in particular it illustrates what is meant by this notion of redundancy range here. I can also give you the full definition of the redundancy range in an additional slide if you ask me in the Q&A, but for the moment I'll just give you the example. So here's a simple voting scenario. A philosophy institute is electing a new director. Ling is the only candidate. As these things go, 5 faculty members are eligible to vote, and Ling will win the election if at least 3 of them vote for her. So it's a simple majority vote. All 5 faculty members vote for Ling, and she wins the election. Now the question is, was Peter's vote a cause of Ling's victory, assuming that he's one of the 5 faculty members? And now, as you can see here, this is a classical overdetermination structure. So if you apply Lewis's original counterfactual theory to this, you will get that Peter's vote did not make a difference, because even if he hadn't voted for Ling, she would have won the election. But this seems to be a major weakness of the simple difference-making accounts of causation, and Woodward's complicated definition is supposed to provide a solution for that problem. And so here's how it works. So you can define variables that describe what's going on like this. So x describes if Peter votes for Ling, y if she wins the election, and here then you have 4 other variables that describe the voting behavior of the other faculty members. And so here, the causal graph will look as follows. So all of them are potential causes of y. And now, Woodward's definition says that you should, in order to determine whether x is a cause of y, you should look at the possible values of z1 to z4 within the redundancy range of these variables. And the redundancy range is the combination of values of these variables that leave leaves the causal relation between x and y intact. So given that 3 votes would have been sufficient for her to win the election, you can turn down or turn off, so to speak, 2 of the variables. So, for instance, one of the combinations of values for these 4 variables that leaves the relation intact is the one where Z1 and Z2 vote differently, and Z3 and Z4 vote for Ling. And now the idea is that if you can find such a combination of values that satisfies these constraints, and if for that combination of values the variable you're interested in becomes a difference maker for the effect, then that's sufficient for concluding that it's an actual cause or was an actual cause of the effect. And this is actually what's happening here. So x equals 1 is a cause of y equals 1 because there is such a combination of values of the z variables such that x becomes a difference maker for y. And this is, well, the interventionist solution to the problem of redundant causal structures, basically. So, again, if you ask whether Peter's vote was a cause of Link's victory, then the interventionist criteria says yes, because we can combine the other causes of Link's election in such a way that his causal contribution becomes evident, and evident here means becomes a difference maker. Okay, so far so good, no indeterminacy so far. And now, what happens if we apply this to the genitor case? Now, this is just the original example, and these now are the variables that describe what's going on. So x describes whether the genitor does nothing or something, and y whether Jane cancels her class or whether she doesn't cancel her class. And then, according to the interventionist criterion, we have to say that x equals 1 causes y to be 1 because there is an intervention on x, namely the specific intervention that prompts the genitor to fix Jane's classroom instead of doing nothing, that makes a difference for y. So here, because there are just 2 variables, you don't even have to care about the redundancy range, so the redundancy range only becomes relevant if there are additional variables that do not lie on the causal path you're interested in. So, and here, interventionism simply says that the genitor's doing nothing causes Jane to cancel her class, but if you believe that Bernstein's and Swanson's arguments are true, then you've got a problem. So that is, I think, the first indeterminacy problem for interventionism. Now, here's a second problem. This is a very different scenario, and it's actually something that has been discussed quite a lot in theories of collective action and collective responsibility. So, flying to a conference. And the original example is due to Christine Tiefensee in a recent paper. In 2023, Susie flew to a conference venue and emitted 150 kilograms of CO2. So this is actually a realistic number if you take a flight within Europe, say. And in 2024, global warming exceeded the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit for the first time. And now, was Susie's flight in 2023 one of the causes that led to the missing of that goal in 2024? Now, some people, theories of collective action, say no, because in fact, Susie's behavior doesn't make a difference for global warming because her contribution is too small, but as we know, this type of reasoning is problematic because if you apply that to the parity of reasoning, if you apply that to all other possible agents, then it turns out that nobody causes climate change, and also if you think that causation is a necessary condition of responsibility, that also implies that nobody can be held responsible for it. So, simply to answer no to this question might be problematic. Now you might say, okay, but this is just like a large-scale voting scenario. So there's a single effect, and then there are multiple agents, and they all contribute to it. So what you would have to do is just to find a situation where Susie's action was a difference maker. And now Tiefens's point is that in this scenario, you won't find this scenario. And so here's why. So you can model this situation by these two variables, and then interventionism will rule that x equals 1 does not cause y to be 1. Why not? Well, suppose that n CO2 molecules emitted at the end of 2023 were sufficient to miss the 1.5 degrees Celsius target in 2024. And now, suppose that actually the number of CO2 molecules emitted was probably well above the threshold that would have been sufficient for having that consequence. But then you can just apply an ordinary vagueness argument to that, because then you could just start a Soriety series by reducing the number of CO2 molecules emitted, and at some point the number of CO2 molecules emitted by the end of 2023 will no longer be sufficient to miss that target in 2024. However, there's no exact threshold that determines when this happens, but only a very large grey area. And if you don't like talking about single CO2 molecules, you could probably also talk about kilograms of CO2 or tons of CO2. So this is so large scale that this would still work. But then, for Susie's action to be a difference maker for the missing of the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, one would have to find a hypothetical scenario in which her action makes a difference. But since this grey area is so large and her contribution is so small, that she will never be a clear difference maker. So you will never find a situation where her action makes the crucial difference for the reaching of that goal. And then, interventionism has to conclude that her action wasn't causally relevant to climate change. But as I already pointed out, that conclusion seems to be problematic. So one thing is that because of that connection between causation and this possibility, another argument is that if you apply a different understanding of causation to this case, then you would say that Susie's action clearly was a cause of what's going on, because climate change is a physical process, and if you have a physical theory of causation, you would just say, okay, so Susie's action was part of that large physical process. So there seems to be a problem here. So this is just a quick summary of the argument. So in the Geneva scenario, I think there's reason to believe that the causal relations in questions are indeterminate, but the standard interventionist criterion implies that they occur determinately. In the flying to a conference scenario, this is somewhat converse to this, so there's reason to believe that the causal relation in question occurs determinately, but interventionism denies this. And And now the idea is to, well, use the machinery of precipitations and supervaluationism to address these problems. Okay, so here's, and I'll be very brief on this, but I'll be happy to say more about it in the Q&A. So here's the basic idea of supervaluationism as it was developed in order to analyze cases of semantic vagueness. So I think the cases of semantic vagueness should be familiar to everyone. So like being bold is a vague predicate because there's no exact number of hairs that somebody has to have in order to count as bald or not bald. And the idea of supervaluationism is to explain vagueness in terms of precisifications, which would then, this is very sketchy, give us the following truth conditions for statements containing vague predicates, such as is bald. So Peter is bald is determinately true if and only if it is true under all precisifications. It's determinately false if it is false under all precisifications. And it is indeterminate in all other cases, that is, if it is true under some precisifications and false under others. And now the question here is, what are these precisifications? And if we're still considering semantic vagueness, so a semantic precisification, so this is a characterization that Rosanna O'Keeffe gives, but I think it's more or less standard, is a specific, non-vague, admissible sharpening of a linguistic term, and this linguistic term will typically be a predicate. Now, the idea is that, so a precisification of is bald takes the following form: a person with n hairs is not bald, a person with n minus 1 hairs is bald. So the precisification gives you the threshold value, and the idea is that it has to give you the threshold value in an admissible way. So if you claim that replacing n with 10 is a precisification, that wouldn't be admissible because it wouldn't be a reasonable threshold value here. And then the idea is that you could say that, for instance, if this person, Peter, he has only, like, I don't know, 1,000 hairs left on his head, then you could say, okay, this is well below the threshold value, no matter how exactly you define that threshold value, and therefore he is a clear case of being bald, and therefore the statement Peter is bald is determinately true. But if he is within that grey area, then it might have an indeterminate, or be neither determinately true or nor determinately false. So the problem is that you might say, okay, so we've been talking about causal indeterminacy, why not just do the same thing to the term causes? So causes is also a predicate, so it's a 2 plus predicate, and let's just apply this to that term. And the problem is that doesn't seem to work well. So, for instance, in the genitor case, there does not seem to be a reasonable way to sharpen the term causes so that the genitor calls Jane rather than Kim to cancel her class, because that's what you would need in order to decide that question. But the reason why we cannot decide that question doesn't seem to depend on our not being able to analyze the notion of causation well. So there seems to be a different problem here. And also, that other problem does not, so the climate change problem, does not seem to depend on our understanding of causation, at least not if you decide to remain within the interventionist framework of causation. So we need something else. Now, some people, and most prominently Elizabeth Barnes and Robbie Williams, have argued in recent years that there's not only semantic indeterminacy but also metaphysical indeterminacy. And they've proposed a notion of metaphysical precisification. And so according to them, metaphysical precisification is a possible world, or a precisificationally possible world, that is a world that does not determinately misrepresent reality. So if you have these indeterminate cases, then the precisification are all worlds that are, loosely speaking, compatible with what you know about these cases. And now my idea is to apply this notion to what's going on in the causal indeterminacy cases. So I'm first going to give you the definition, or a sketch of the definition, and then I'm going to explain what it does. So here's the idea. We use Woodward's interventionist criterion of actual causation and say that x equals x is an actual cause of y equals y, and here means determinately is, if and only if the interventionist criterion is satisfied for all metaphysical precisifications of the interventions and the background conditions. And I'm going to understand those in the metaphysical way. X is not an actual cause of y if the criterion is not satisfied for any of those precisifications, and it is indeterminate whether x is an actual cause of y if and only if there is a metaphysical precisification for which the criterion is satisfied and one for which it is not satisfied. So this is just structurally analogous to the truth conditions that you find in theories of semantic vagueness, but it's applied to the interventionist criterion of causation. And of course here I have to say more about this. So let's first consider the metaphysical precisification of the interventions. Now here, these precisifications are supposed to be possible worlds that do not determinately misrepresent the state described by the alternative value of the intervened variable, given the actual state of the world. So it's not the actual world because the interventions are creating hypothetical situations, so you have to consider other hypothetical situations. And here you consider all the hypothetical situations, but do not determinately misrepresent what's going on here. So if you consider this variable, so what we're now interested in here is the possible worlds that represent what's going on here. So the janitor does something rather than nothing. And the idea is that according to the context, a world in which the janitor fixes Jane's classroom rather than doing nothing is a metaphysical precisification of an intervention on X, but a world in which he turns into a wizard and fixes all classrooms within 3 seconds is not, because this would determinately misrepresent the actual state of the world. Likewise, if you consider the Susie flies to the conference case, again we are interested in this alternative value of the variable, and then you would say, okay, a world in which Susie takes the train to the conference venue, or where she decides not to go to the conference at all, or to participate online or something like that, is a metaphysical precisification of this intervention, but a world in which she enters a rocket and flies to the moon is not. So the idea is that the possibilities must not be too far off. And now, how about the metaphysical precisifications of the background conditions? Here, the background conditions are actually the actual conditions, so the conditions obtaining of the actual world. And those precisifications are the possible rules that do not determinately misrepresent the actual world. And this becomes important in the climate change case, because here a precisification would specify or give you a particular value for this n. So it would function analogously to the baldness case. So you just fix a threshold for the number of CO2 molecules that are sufficient for the missing of the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And then, of course, n must be such that the state of the actual world is not determinately misrepresented. And the idea is, sorry, that was a bit too quick. Okay, I'm coming back to this. Okay, sorry. So, and now, with these notions in mind, let's consider the two cases once again. So this is the janitor case, and then the idea is that in this case there is a precisification according to which he fixes Jane's classroom, and there is a precisification in which he fixes Kim's classroom, and therefore it's indeterminate whether x is being 1 caused y to be 1 because under precisification 1, x is a difference maker for y, under precisification 2 is not. The difference making here is relevant for causation, or the criterion of causation. In the flying to a conference case, you would say, okay, precisifications have the form as in the baldness case, n CO2 molecules emitted at the end of 2023 lead to the missing of the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, n minus 1 molecules do not. And now, the trick, so to speak, is to say that x equals 1 determinately causes y equals 1 because x satisfies the interventionist criterion of actual causation for all reasonable precisifications of the background condition. Namely, if you assume that there is a concrete threshold value above which the CO2 emissions result in y equals 1, then one could find a scenario in which x makes a difference to y. However, the world leaves it indeterminate where precisely this threshold value is. So that's the idea. And so here's my conclusion. I've discussed two types of causal structures involving indeterminacy, the janitor case and the flying to a conference case. And I think that interventionism gives the wrong verdicts for both types of scenarios. And my hope is, or my argument was, that supervaluationist interventionism is better equipped to handle them. But there are other questions. So my hope is that this indeterminacy is metaphysical, but I'm not entirely sure about it, and I'm happy to discuss it. I think that it's probably not epistemic, so these cases are probably not such that we just don't know enough about them. And then one other thing I'm thinking about, and that I would also like to discuss, is whether you could also apply something of this framework to indeterministic processes, or maybe even quantum indeterminacy. So here are my references. Thank you.
So Lisa will be giving her comments, and she has some slides.
Let me start by thanking Vera for this very interesting paper and talk I really enjoyed. And as the last presenter, let me also thank the organizers for this great workshop. So I did big symbol summaries for Vera's project and the overall account, and think that it's like, as far as I can tell, it looks really promising to me. So I have more smaller points that connect first to Vera's argument against the standard interventionist account, and then two more points that relate exactly to the last two questions that Vera raised as questions for further research. So first about the problem for standard interventionism. So Vera's claim in the talk was that the basic problem for standard interventionism is that it gives us wrong verdicts in the cases. So in the cases of the janitor, like the intuitive verdict would be that we have indeterminate causal relations, but according to standard interventionism, we would have that they occur determinately, so that the janitors doing nothing determinately cause Jane's class to be cancelled. And in the flying to the conference case, we would intuitively want to get the verdict that the causal relations occur determinately, so that her flying was determinately a cause for the limit to be exceeded, while standard interventionism does not yield that result. And here, as soon as we move from the more like the big picture characterization of interventionism to really how the formal causal models are set up, it seemed to me that there is a problem for interventionism, as Vera has it, but that there's in fact an even deeper problem, that we get wrong verdicts. Namely that we can't even get any models that correctly represent the cases and to which we then could apply our account to figure out whether there's a causal relation. And very basically, the idea is that in causal models, apart from these structures with the vertices and edges between them, we also have structural equations that state the values of these variables. So for the first variables on the very left, these equations give us like numeric values for the equations. For the ones that come later, these equations state like give us functions of the values of the later variables in terms of the ones of the earlier variables. And then if this connection is indeterminate, it seems we can't even state these equations that we would need in standard interventionism. So as an example, let's consider just the janitor case, which is a bit easier. So here we would have a very simple causal model, just the variables x and y. X, the value of x is 1 if the janitor does nothing, 0 otherwise, and y, it's 1 if she can and 0 otherwise. Now, these are the same ones that we already had in Vera's talk. Now, if we would additionally add the equations, we would have here x equals 1 for the janitor does nothing, which was what actually happened. But then we would also need to have a structural equation for variable y. And the two natural candidates would seem to be that we have that y equals 1 if x equals 1, so she cancels the class if the janitor does nothing. But then we also need a part of the equation that tells us what's the value for y if x equals 0. And both options seem to misrepresent the case because as the case is given, the connection between the two is indeterminate. So it seems we can't even set up the variables and then try to get a verdict. So it seems to me that Vera is right that we need to modify standard interventionism, but perhaps for a different reason, because we can't even give the models. And the flying case is slightly more complicated, but it's basically the same issue here. So that was my first point. Then the second point I wanted to make concerns these indeterministic processes and the background conditions. So at the end, Vera said that she leaves it open whether the account could also be applied to cases of genuine indeterministic cases, such as perhaps in quantum processes. But now it seemed to me that if it's construed in a realistic way, it seemed to me that probably also the climate change case should be conceived of as an indeterministic process if we want to hold it as indeterminacy that's not really epistemic. So it seems to me that actually what we have is an indeterministic process that leads from the CO2 emissions to the warming, or more precisely to reaching this, getting over this 1.5 degrees value. And in this case, the model would look slightly different, that we would have like a first node for the action of Susie and other people, then in the middle a node that would give us that a certain amount of CO2 atoms were emitted, and then from this one we would get as the next one the global warming occurring. So if you would model it in this way rather than putting it into the background condition, the threshold, it seems it would look probably exactly alike to the cases where we would have the indeterministic processes. And then I guess the idea would be that somewhat the difference is that in this case we are somewhat allowed to put it into the background conditions, but then it wasn't entirely clear to me in which cases we are allowed, in which cases we aren't, what's here the criterion. And if we don't have it in the background conditions exactly, then the account would no longer apply, then we would need an account where you can really like somewhat precify the interventionist counterfactuals that correspond to the connection of the values between the variables. Yes, I mean, perhaps the idea is that it's not here in this case an indeterministic process, but somewhat like a variety series, but here it wasn't fully clear to me because it seems, given that we have these different, so it might sound at first like weird, like how can one CO2 molecule, more one flight, like make the difference? But then if you think about it like perhaps a bit simplistic, like one more molecule leads to 0.0001 more temperature, then it doesn't seem to be surprising that by like one tiny action we get over the threshold anymore. So it seems to me that the only good way I could think about it, this case, was in terms of an indeterministic process. So I was wondering about that too. And at the end, only a slight point, tiny point about the kind of indeterminacy. So Vera wanted to leave it open whether the indeterminacy is metaphysical or semantic. And yes, I just found that it might be interesting to discuss it because I found it very hard to wrap my head around the idea that in these cases it could be merely a semantic one. So I was wondering whether perhaps you thought about other cases where it's more plausible to think that they are semantic, but yes, in these cases, as they stand, I found it very hard to think that they are semantic because yes, it's hard to see which terms we could specify here. Yeah. And then exactly, I was also wondering perhaps if there's cases where it's more plausible to think that they are semantic, whether that would still go well together with the metaphysical specifications that Vera assumes whether these are possible worlds. Perhaps I thought then perhaps we could think about the semantic indeterminacy as a metaphysical one about metasemantic facts. Perhaps we could do it that way. But yes, I was just wondering how it works. So yes, these were my questions. Thanks.
Thank you. You want to respond?
Yeah, that would be great. So, first of all, thank you so much. So, this is very much to the point, and it's yeah, it's great. So let me just say 3 quick things about this. So your first point was what's the structural equation, and you're right. So if you try to describe this in terms of determinate structural equations, the problem already arises there. That didn't, well, formulate that properly. Let me just say how I came to the conclusion that interventionism still gives you a determinate verdict here. And so one reason is that Woodward often doesn't spell out the structural equations, but just talks about the interventions, and then he has this whole machinery defining interventions. And here my idea was, okay, in this particular case you could carry out at least 4 possible interventions. So like projects the janitor had to fix classroom A, B, C, and D. And each one of them counts as an intervention, and according to his theory, he just says that he just makes an existential claim in the sense that he says if there is an intervention that changes the effect variable, that's sufficient for actual causation. Also, so that's one line of thought, and the other line of thought is that if you build in a probabilistic element from the start, you also get that result. Because then you would say, okay, if he does something rather than nothing, this will increase the probability that Jane does not have to cancel the class. So that's the idea. But I framed this in terms of deterministic structural equations, or that, at least in the paper, that was the background condition, and you're totally right there. Then the other point about whether, so that's the last point. Now remind me what the second point was, is
You can also go to the slide.
yeah, maybe we could just go back to the previous.
I left it there at the table.
Oh, we could. So indeterministic processes. I was trying to be cautious here, and because I was trying to make a case where you wouldn't need to make the assumption that you need genuinely indeterministic processes in order to get that result. And this is, I think, also what Tiefensee thinks, but maybe you're right, you won't get that. So my assumption here was that you would get that Sorites series even if you think that everything is deterministic. But maybe that's not true, I would have to think about this more. And then, why should, or might we think that the indeterminacy is semantic? So the worry I had in mind here was that somebody might say, okay, well, the variables you're using, they are just representational tools. And so the indeterminacy that you get in the genitive case is just because this, so here, this zero value, I can't point it out. So the zero value of x is just an imprecise description of what's going on. That's just a semantic thing. So maybe not strictly speaking semantic in terms of natural language, but still it's a representational issue and it's not a metaphysical issue. And I think so, Barnes and Williams, actually, they have a they want to define metaphysical indeterminacy, but they also have a notion of possible worlds where, so they just use possible worlds as representational tools. And I think if you do that, then you might even say, okay, this is semantic, and then we just use possible worlds as semantic, as representational tools in order to describe this case. So, but here I was trying, just trying to be cautious here. But again, thank you so much. This is very helpful.
Alyssa.
Thank you. Yeah, this is, it's really, really good. I don't like the case. I'm sorry. And I know, like, maybe I have a prejudice against causation by absence, but can I just, I think that he caused all the classes to be canceled or none of them, and I guess I don't know which one, but I thought the right causal diagram for this was you have, I want to go up there, but I don't want to overstep.
I think we would need the other presentation for that.
No, I can just go for it, but I don't want to overstep because I don't know how much time we have.
That would be okay if you want to.
Okay. I just feel like the...
okay, sorry.
The other one?
Isn't the causal diagram for your case, the janitor case, isn't the causal diagram for the janitor case this? 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, and then you have like one person's class goes, one person's class goes, one person's class goes, and then this is off and this is off. This is like, yeah, he fixes it, and then her class.
Yeah.
And then, but I guess I'm like, why don't you just have, I just don't know how to think about this case, but I feel like, why don't you have a case that's like one where that's like this, I feel like it's a better case. So what I was thinking was something like,
Right.
I'm at a restaurant last night, and I order a glass of wine, and there are, I guess, two waiters floating around, and one brings me a Chardonnay, and one brings me a Riesling, and yeah, it's like this, and it's like, what did I order? Did I order the Riesling, or did I order the Chardonnay?
Yeah.
It's indeterminate, but I definitely only ordered one drink. That's like, I feel like I have a really clear intuition because like I said something, there's more of like, it's not a causation by absence, that I ordered something and I didn't order two glasses of wine. And then it's like indeterminate which one, because I ordered a white wine or something. But like in your case, I just can't, I'm sorry, maybe when I was like, what's going on? Everybody else probably had the intuition, I'm just weird. But is there a reason you have to do with absences?
Yeah, it's, well, let me answer the first point and then I'm going to talk about absences. So I mean, this is the picture that the causal baseness person would probably draw here. So she would just say, okay, so this just increases the probability of James having to cancel the class, and since they're all equal, we just divide by 4. Okay. And now the reason why I think people like Sarah Bernstein don't swallow that is that they have this connection between causation and responsibility. And then you would say, so suppose he was, I don't know, he had to pay for all of the, for all of the lectures that have to be cancelled, say. And then there is an intuition to the effect that it would be unfair to make him pay for 4 classes, because he wouldn't have had a chance to fix all 4 of them.
That's why I put 0.25 there.
Yeah, but the problem is, okay, but the problem is that the basenet person would also say, she wouldn't say that the janitors doing nothing caused this to degree 0.25 or something like that. She would just say he caused all 4 of them, and that would be unfair. So because then you would say, okay, so he should be made to pay for only 1 of them, and okay, and then I mean you could discuss whether you distribute this among the lecturers or something like that. But you shouldn't say, and that I think is the problematic part. So according to causal baseness, you would just say, okay, this is a direct cause with all 4 of them, because it changes the probability, full stop. And it wouldn't make a difference if there were more or less effects here. About the ordering a glass of wine case, that is a very interesting case, because here my intuition differs from yours.
Okay.
Because I would just say, in that case, you caused both glasses of wine to be served to you, and it was just a misunderstanding among the waiters. But that's but
I ordered 2.
if you ordered 2, and then did you? Yeah, I mean, so the thing would be, okay, you might say, okay, so you ordered 1, and did you cause the Riesling to be served to you? So that would be the question, because you just order a glass of wine, say, and then.
Order for 1 cause 2 to be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I guess ordering is so hyper-intentional or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but and this is also the reason why so it's at least difficult to find structures like this that do not involve absences or prevention. So I mean, a different case would be prevention cases. So you could say, okay, so somebody's child kicks a ball somewhere, and I don't know, the mother catches the ball. Did you prevent that object from breaking? And if you think that it's an indeterministic process. It's not, might not be determinate whether she prevented an object from breaking. But still, you always have this, so you always have an absence on either side. But if you have a case that's not like that, yeah, okay. I'm going to have to think about this more, but thank you so much. This is helpful. Thank you.
Nick.
Yeah, thanks as well. Okay, so I think I don't quite get the idea of metaphysical precisification because, so I don't get what it is to not determinately misrepresent, because I'm thinking about, so this is the other case, the flying to the conference and the precisification n that you give. Why doesn't that determinately misrepresent a world in which there is no particular n sort of at all? And in some ways, it's the leads that's making me bothered here. There is no n that actually led this to happen. So why isn't this yeah, if that makes sense.
Okay. So the idea is that a precisification, so the only other condition that a precisification has to satisfy, and I didn't mention it explicitly, is that it resolves the indeterminacy. And then you might just say, okay, if it's impossible to do so, then you might just say, okay, there is no precisification. But then, so the idea is, this is a tricky issue, but the idea then is you find a possible world, or a model, if you like, that is precise in all respects and contradicts the actual world as little as possible. So that's the idea. And then you consider all those models. This is something. I think this is actually. I don't want to postpone the problem to other people, but I think this is also a problem that Barnes and Williams face with their approach.
Yeah. Okay. Because the leads sort of sounds to me like a counterfactual, right? So if there were n or more molecules, then it would be over, and if there were not, and if there were not, then it wouldn't. So it's not a categorical, there's a counterfactual in there, and that's quite different to the way the world is. There is no counterfactual like that, that's true.
Yeah, okay, I see. Okay, so that is the point. So the point is that you have like a counterfactual structure on top, so to speak. Okay, I see. Yeah, I would have to think about that because it's also not just a possible precise description of how the world could be. Okay, I see. Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah.
Baptiste.
I'm not sure what to ask. I have any question more of understanding also some ideas about the physics. We already mentioned some of yesterday, but could you clarify what's the relation between veil causation and causation by degrees of causation? I think I kind of see it, but not clearly enough. I will just want you to help me to really articulate the difference.
So I actually think that they're completely logically independent.
Yes.
So I would say that, so you could basically have all four. Yeah? So you could say that there are cases of causation that do not allow for degrees and are not indeterminate. Then I would say, for instance, in the Geneva case, I would say that's a case where you don't have causation by degrees. So this I don't remember my chair in this situation, but I would say this doesn't give you a degree of causation or anything like that. So you have causal indeterminacy, but you don't have degrees of causation. And then I think the climate change case might be one way you have both, because you also have the larger your causal contribution is, or the larger the amount of CO2 molecules you emit is, the larger your causal contribution is. And I think you can also have cases of degrees of causation which do not involve indeterminacy. I don't know if the two of us lift this table, then we could just say, okay, there's no causal indeterminacy. We determinately both contributed to it, but we could theoretically measure the causal contributions that we made. So that's the idea. But I think they're logically independent.
Yes, that's helpful. Do we have a lot of time? Otherwise, we can...
Maybe I'll put you back.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, Maria.
Thank you. I'm trying to understand a little bit better this idea of difference maker. And I was thinking especially in the case of the climate change example. So if I understood correctly, I forgot who took it. Oh, was it Susie? Susie took a plane ride and she emitted some CO2. And then the question was she a difference maker for this rise in temperature? And the value that she emitted, or the amount she emitted, was not big enough to sort of cover that gray area. So it lies within this. And therefore it's not clear that she was a difference maker. And then I was wondering if there's a different way to set this up or why this doesn't work. So I was thinking maybe you have, instead of looking just at Susie, you could look at a population of people, the emission of which is large enough to sort of cover this whole area. And you can say, at least with this population, the emission that they have would be a difference maker. And then once you establish that, you could maybe ask, well, for this one, is Susie for that population a difference maker in the emission? And then have to sort of transitive causal relation or responsibility. So I was wondering how it fits into or why it doesn't fit into. Or
Yeah. So that's a very interesting point. I mean, so you're totally right. Oh, sorry, did I interrupt you? No. Okay. So I mean, that's a very interesting point. Of course, you're right. So if you, I don't know, take something like the decisions of the German government in the past years or something like that. Like, then you could say, okay, maybe this is large enough as an amount of difference making that you could just even find a scenario in which that transcends this gray area. And then you can say, okay, and then there are all these people who elected those people, etc. I think you could do this. A reason why I'm a little bit hesitant to do this is that difference making in general is not transitive. So you can find cases where A makes a difference for B, B makes a difference for C, but A doesn't make a difference for C. And then at least you would have to make this additional assumption that this is not the case like this. And you might be able to do this, but I don't think you can just assume it. So.
Annika.
thank you. I have a difficulty to see why this case that's on the left, so which was the Geneva case. Why, with respect to determinacy and indeterminacy, that's different, really, from the slipped case where we have, so like the voting case of that. And I think Bernstein also in the paper actually thinks that both kinds of situations have indeterminacy. So I really appreciate your effort to use less violent examples. So let's also transform that example. So where, I don't know, a group of people, everyone could have closed the window, but no one did, and now the rain ruined the floor. And that kind of example she also considers to be indeterminate. And just the symmetry kind of makes this to me quite plausible. I don't know, I find this quite appealing. But then just classical interventionism already rules that out. Or rather also,
So what's the other example you have in mind? So it's like somebody needs to close the window and everyone in this room would be able to do so.
Yes, exactly, but no one does.
But no one that would be okay. That would be somehow analogous, but there are multiple agents at the single effect. Okay, I see. And would you say?
So if I think that would be quite similar to the voting case, in that classical interventionism would already say that actually all these agents are causally relevant. Yeah, I'm just quite sympathetic to the view that this symmetry is also that a symmetry with respect to determinacy.
And we'll have to look exactly into what Blomstein says about
Okay.
but
She just mentioned, like in one phrase, we can also have indeterminacy with respect to the causes, as if everyone of a group of people could have saved a drowning child.
yeah, but then I mean I have actually different intuitions about that one, because I would say, okay, if none of us close the window and then there's a thunderstorm or the carpet gets wet, then all of us are responsible for it, because all of us could have made a difference if we just closed the window. But yeah, so this is why I would say it's and all of us are responsible for that here in this sense. So I mean, responsibility need not necessarily always translate into causation, but in this case, I would say there's there more or less one correspondence between the two. But yeah.
Yes, I was going to talk about the causal set theory. So I'm going to try to talk about it in a way that is both interesting for people who have heard about it and for people who never heard about it. So that theory, trying to make progress, foundations of physics, and it has been claimed by Chris as a paper with Craig Calendar, was to say you have a growing structure. You can interpret this theory as having a flow, something growing. If you are ready to have some kind of radical metaphysical assumptions, and you have to have you will have a kind of exotic flow requiring vagueness, probably some kind of metaphysical vagueness, and I think it's also, independently of this, it's also reasonable to think that it's a causal theory, that the relations of growth are causal. And so if you combine the two things, it follows that there is some kind of metaphysical causation happening there. And one way to see how it's causal, you can think of the growth from one point to 2 points, so either the second point is causally connected to the first or it's not. And then you have the third point, right? So you start with 1 point, another one connected, and the third one not connected. And so CST says that the dynamics say that there are 2 paths that lead to these 3 elements causal set. One where it's first, stage 1, the connected element happened, and in the other possibility, it's the other way around. So when we get to the stage 3, well, with the 3 point relatively to this stage, there is no matter of fact about what was the path taken. And so there is no matter of fact about the ordering, the partial ordering of the causal relations. So that seems to be some possible case of causal indeterminacy. No, I don't know exactly how it relates to the cases you had in mind. Maybe it's different, maybe it's the same. I don't know, I don't yet have a clear enough mind to really connect it to the cases you have been discussing. But that would be interesting because there might be a case of fundamental causation, which might be metaphysically indeterminate. And I'm also a bit unclear whether how it will work with the supervaluationist approach. But at least we have been with Bern, we have been applying interventionism there, showing that yes, you have causation according to interventionism, so it may be interesting. But I guess I'm just putting that here
and so this is very interesting. I mean, so is this a case where you would say that there determinately is a causal error between 2 variables, but its direction is indeterminate? Because that would be, I mean, that would be a different case.
I would say like what's causally determinate is that you have one stage causing the next, and the cardinality is fixed.
Okay, right.
But there is no, some fact seems to be missing, right? There is no matter of fact about what was the internal structure of the stages that led to where we are. But you have a causal direction. This is determinate. The cardinality is determinate. Yeah, please step in you.
I have a finger on this. So first of all, there's two things that are going on. First, we have causal relations among the elements in that set, and whether the growth process on top of that, which is also a partial ordering and sort of in some sense a temporal sequence, is also causal. That's sort of an additional, not necessarily identical question.
I mentioned it to Vera last year at dinner.
Okay. And the second point is, it seems to me that, you might then think straightforward, perfectly flat-footed application of supervaluationism in this context from somebody who's just thought about this problem 30 seconds ago for the first time, would be to say the precipitations are the different possible paths it could have taken, none of which is determinately the case somehow, but is one possible way of a sequence that there could have been, and then given that on some of these precipitations this is the case and on others it isn't, then I think on your account it would come out as indeterminate causation. That would be my immediate sort of reaction.
Yeah, the question is, so what would happen if you applied the interventionist criterion to this? Because, so you could also treat this janitor case analogously and just say, oh, okay, so there's indeterminacy. So what we just have is we have 4 different precipitations. Namely, one was an error here, an error here, an error here, and an error here. But that wouldn't explain anything. So, and I was just wondering whether that's, you could say, oh, okay, so if you just say, okay, the precipitation is just the possible causal structure that you could draw, then you could capture those cases, but I think only at a descriptive level, so to speak. Maybe that's all we want. But you wouldn't. So I think the interesting question here would be, what would the interventionist criterion of causation say about this case?
You have probability distributions, and when you intervene and change something, you change the probability distributions. So some possibilities are no longer possible, and the probabilities are updated in a way. So I think that works with the probabilistic.
Yeah, but then you would get, if it changes the probability distribution, then you would just say, okay, interventionism would just say, okay, that it determinately causes the values of the other variables, because probability change is sufficient for causation.
Right. Yep.
I think there would also be the analog of Nick's question from earlier on, because the theory tells us that there's no fact about which of the two of the different ways it actually grew. So in a way, none of them is physically possible, or a way that the world could have evolved. So there are precipitations which are somehow, maybe metaphysically, I don't know, but physically not possible really as such. And then I think we would run into similar questions again.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, it's a complicated case.
So what's difficult is that there is a narrow in a way, but it's like from this point, if in a way, if you move back in the past, so you have this kind of growing block picture in mind. If you go to the past, and the block shrinks down back, then you can have those questions about changing things. But when you are here at the next stage, from this point of view, there is metaphysical determinacy about what led to here, and that's super weird. I think that's the only place in physics if you have something like that. So it's very difficult to see how to combine the two conflicting schemes.
I mean, I would definitely like to.
I will send you some stuff.
It sounds very.
Enrico has a finger on that.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe even before looking at this, because I've set examples, one can just find like, one can sort of warm up and already find actually a lot of interesting.
With the ADS CFT? Or?
No.
Just kidding.
A lot of interesting consequences already sort of with something that is maybe a lot more under control, which is this quantum switch scenarios, which people take to imply that, well, they use the same sentence, so they talk about causal indeterminacy. So these situations where one, as an experimenter, is like some particle entering into an apparatus and going, there are two possible trajectories, and there's a switch that gets turned on, and the side switch trajectory goes, and then the switch becomes a quantum state, the quantum state itself. So it always ends in the same place, it starts in the same place, but then the switch can be in a superposition between going, I don't know, like this way or this way. And that in some senses, like there is in some quite literal sense a case in which the causal process that leads from input to output is indeterminate because it's quantum indeterminate to some extent. And the interesting bit of that example, apart from the fact that it's sort of a lot more under control because at the end of the day it's just quantum mechanics, so it's much easier maybe to deal with, is that at least for these cases of quantum indeterminacy, maybe people know more about me and can correct, but I have a sense that people actually have somewhat decent arguments against this type of supervaluationist theories of indeterminacy. So there might even be some kind of tricky issue which stops this type of account and requires something more complicated than just supervaluationism. But I'm not really qualified to say what. But I was just thinking that there might even be like maybe like a much more straightforward example of some of these issues that doesn't require all this high-powered machinery.
Okay. So what will you say? What papers or what should I look into in order to get a sense of that? Because I mean, it would be interesting.
Yeah, Laurie has some in philosophy. Laurie Letertre. Otherwise, there are some physics papers where people. Huh?
Julia. I mean, sorry.
Chiribella.
Yeah,
Yes. Those are the physics papers. So Chiribella, Dariano.
But he's very clear.
Yeah, no, yeah, they're really good.
But it's just, there are two diagrams. Or
Yeah.
there are two, no, it's not two diagrams, it's two different,
There are like paths.
instantiations of
Yeah. So
actual causes.
Okay.
It's a bit of a tricky.
But it's different than these cases because I thought here it was like indeterminate what the effect was.
Yeah, there is more the causal
Yeah.
process that is
Structure.
indeterminate. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, but maybe.
It's maybe closer to what causal set theory suspect, because if you understand the example you guys are talking about, you always end up in the same place at the end of the day. It's just that you get there in different ways.
That
Maybe I'm going
depends.
to ask you this question again, but it's also what I should read. So maybe, okay, thank you.
So whether it's the same depends very sensitively on exactly how you think of that growth in causal set theory. And keeping in mind that this so far is just a classical probabilistic theory on top of that, quantum superpositions would then have to be added somehow. Okay, please join me in thanking Vera.